Once again, I would like to welcome all of you to the ICWA Conference on India and Japan and 70 years of relations. Now we will begin the fourth session of the conference, India-Japan Economic and Development Cooperation, Emerging Dynamics. We have with us Professor Prabir, Professor Research and Information System for Developing Countries. RIS chair session. The speakers for the session are Professor Makoto Kojima, Professor Emeritus, Takushoku University and Senior Fellow Center for Contemporary Indian Studies, India-Japan Association, Dr. Nisha Taneja, Professor, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi, Dr. Kalpana, Tokas, Assistant Professor, Narsee, Monjee, Institute of Management Studies, Mumbai. Before handing the floor to Professor Prabir, allow me to introduce Dr. Prabir is a professor at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries in New Delhi. He is also the head of the ASEAN India Center at RIS. He has over 3 decades of full-time research and teaching experience in India and abroad. He works in the field of international economics and has research interest in international trade and development. He has contributed several research papers in international journals and written books on trade and development. His recent publications include Act East to Act Indo-Pacific, India's Expanding Neighborhood, published by Knowledge World in 2020. He is the founding editor of the Journal of Asian Economic Integration, published by SAGE. Professor Day, I request you to kindly conduct the proceeding.
Thank you, Dr. Jojin, for the introduction, and warm welcome to all the panelists in this session 4. And I'm grateful to ICWA and other organizations for today's conference. And before we start with the session 4, which is devoted on economic and development cooperation, let me share some of my thoughts on economic and commercial relations. 3 speakers we have, 3 eminent scholars. We'll start with Professor Kojima, Dr. Taneja, and Dr. Kalpana there at the end, just to provoke their minds and their presentations. India and Japan are partners. Not only they have a bilateral FTA, we call it CEPA. Both Professor Kojima and myself were part of the joint study group team, I think in 2006-7, I don't remember now. This is almost a 15-16 year story back. We are part of the study. So they are not only just a partner in trade in goods and services, they are also India and Japan and part of G20. They are part of EAS. They are part of Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. And recently, it is in the media that we are going to have a Quad Summit next week, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, IPEF, which is India and Japan, both are members, is going to be launched at Tokyo for the next week. Of course, India, Japan is very much active members of the UN system and also the reforms in the UN system. So very active relations they have. But if you look at the bilaterals, both India, Japan, and I see they have a deficit at current account, but India has a surplus in the capital account because I think it's number I don't have at the moment. Whatever I could collect, the accumulated FDI to Japanese FDI to India is 35 billion. How much is actually utilized, I won't be able to tell, but certainly the speakers will highlight it. But the number is huge, 35 billion, and in the rank, I think Japan comes on the top 5 countries who are investing in India very much. Well, and the trade economies, we will see there would be deficit, there would be surplus. Today's deficit will become tomorrow's surplus, or today's surplus can become a deficit. So that is the story. But sometime in the too much deficit you have at the bilateral level. But if you have a deficit at the current account in aggregate terms of the country, that makes a lot of issues. Plus India, Japan, I see from coming from a trade and investment, India-Japan relations expanded in other areas. Obviously, it is very much that we have an India-Japan digital partnership startup hub. India-Japan are cooperating for ASEAN, India-Japan cooperating for Indian Ocean. And there are several other areas where I see Japan is coming very much investing in India, like India's Northeast. India and Japan are working for ASEAN plus areas. India-Japan has also a very good relation. That's the note I have received on skill development, disaster risk reduction, well, in healthcare, bilateral science and technology cooperation, etc., etc. As I lived in Tokyo almost about 2 years while I was working with an organization, what I found, the number of Indians are staying in Tokyo has gone up. Please, Professor Kojima, make me correct that is it gone up or gone down? But I think the number of Indians living in Japan it is now increased. And so also the Japanese expatriates working in Delhi suburb or in India, that's also increased. So in general, the trend I have noticed that India-Japan economic relations is very strong at the moment. And I'm sure things will be more and more, such good relations will be unfolded in coming times. And today's 3 speakers will highlight that, tell us what are the challenges, what are the issues. And 3 are very eminent speakers. They are known for their contribution on the subject. Professor Kojima will be speaking about issues and prospects for deepening Japan-India economic relation. Professor Kojima is a professor emeritus, Takushoku University is a senior fellow center for contemporary Indian studies, and also a member of India-Japan Association in Tokyo. Professor Taneja is with the professor, is Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. We know them as ICRIAR. And Dr. Kalpana Tokas, assistant professor at the Narsee Monjee Institute of Management Studies in Mumbai. She will be presenting about India-Japan relations in services trade and India-Japan CEPA. So 3 important areas, and certainly I'm looking forward to listen to them. There are audience who will be picking up the questions. I allot 15 minutes to each of them. Dr. Jojin, is it that 15 minutes to each of them? And then it's becoming 45 minutes. Then we have a half an hour time or so for a Q&A. So with that note, I invite, according to the agenda, Professor Kojima to take the floor. And please, Kojima-san, over to you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very grateful to the ICWA for inviting me to this very prestigious conference. And it's my pleasure and honor to have a chance to speak before the eminent participants. Now, today my topic is on issues and prospects for deepening Japan-India economic relations, very wide topic. Let me use PowerPoint for my presentation. Okay.
Slideshow. You may also try using F5 button.
Sorry, okay, I got it. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Today my topics covers various issues, trade, Japan FDI in India, and Japan cooperation for infrastructure development, and bilateral collaboration in ICT. First I start with the national partners in historical perspective. This year, we commemorate the 70th anniversary of India-Japan development relations. However, both Japan and India have much longer period of economic interaction as natural partners. Japan started its modernization since the beginning of the Meiji era in the late 19th century. Japan-India bilateral relations had much to do with the modernization of Japanese industries, especially textile and steel industries. The essence of our relations as natural partners is both competition and collaboration. First, let me look at the textile industry. In the beginning, we just only imported cotton yarn, not raw cotton from India. However, as Japan gradually established its modern cotton spinning industry, we came to import raw cotton, not cotton yarn. We have to say that India was quite friendly to export its raw cotton to Japan. The biggest episode was that their marine route was open between Bombay and Kobe, overcoming the monopoly by the dominant shipping company P&O, thanks to a deep trust relationship between the two leading businessmen representing India and Japan, namely Yamashiro G. Tata and A.H. Shibusawa, now called father of capitalism in modern Japan. Now look at each case of steel industry. India had already established its modern steel mills in 1910s, and much pig iron was exported to Japan. Pig iron means a crude iron, intermediate product of the steel industry. During 1920s, Indian pig iron accounted for more than 40% of the Japanese market. Afterwards, Japan excluded Indian pig iron by consolidating the cartel and raising the tariff. After the World War II, Japan prioritized the revival and modernization of the steel industry for reconstruction of the Japanese economy. At that time, Japan was in urgent need of iron ore rather than pig iron. And India became the most important sources of supply for supporting the Japanese steel industry in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Before the World War II, India accounted for 10 to 15% of the Japanese total trade. Today, it's only 1%. Bilateral India-Japan trade was quite strong just after World War II, accounting for at the time 2 or 4% of Japan trade. Afterward, since the mid-1960s, discrepancy between two countries crept in our relation. Then the importance of bilateral trade declined. Many reasons we can find. First, Indian iron ore came to be replaced by Australia or Brazil. And since the mid-60s, the Japan started with East Asian countries, they made a resurgence. And Japan expanded the horizontal trade with those East Asian countries. Then the relative importance of India declined. I think these are some important reasons why the relative importance declined since mid-1960s. The sluggish trade continued now, even after FTA, CEPA came into effect in 2011. Please look at the right figure. Japanese, this is the Japanese trade, just same with India and Korea trade. And those are ASEAN and China trade with India. Why India and Japan trade stagnated? I think we can find some factors. First, Japanese exports to India have been overwhelmed by Chinese export without FTA with India. And India still struggles to expand its exports of comparative advanced products or competitive products such as the pharmaceutical to the Japanese market because our non-tariff barrier or invisible barriers. So another reason, the horizontal trade has not yet been developed between our two countries, just like Japan and East Asian countries. I think these issues to be overcome in the future. Yeah. Sorry. Well, if you look at the FDI, it's more active compared with the trade. As the chairman mentioned, Japan is one of the main investing countries in India, accounting for 6% of total cumulative FDI inflows from April 2000 to March 2021. Japanese FDI used to be geared to the manufacturing sector. Japanese automaker advance into Indian market contributed Indian improving the Indian manufacturing industry, such as the raising labor skill or the raising improving quality control, and it induced other Japanese companies such involved in steel, machine, power plant to come to India. Now the advance of Japanese companies in India is increasing in a wide range of areas. I think this explanation overlaps with the presentation made by Professor Sravani. We have an increasing number of companies investing in India. According to the latest JBIC report, India is ranked first for the most promising area for investment for Japanese manufacturing companies in the long run. But in the medium term, 3 years, next to China, the secondary most promising areas for investment for Japanese companies. But Japanese companies attracted India because of its future growth prospect of its huge domestic market. However, Japanese challenge and Indian challenges include a lack of infrastructure, a severe competition with other companies, and lack of transparency in the execution of road, just mentioned by Professor Sravani. Now, we move to the topic of Japanese cooperation for infrastructure development. Here I focus on gigantic project, mention some issues. As Ambassador Hirabayashi mentioned, India was the first recipient of Japanese assistance that began in 1958. After 2004, India has been the largest recipient of Japanese ODA. Mainly Japanese ODA are intended for transportation, and Delhi Metro is a successful example of the transfer to India of Japanese operating system construction culture and safety technology. So we can say Japan-India collaboration has contributed to the enhancement of transport connectivity in India. Well, look at the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. This is a very gigantic project with the Western dedicated freight corridor as a backbone. It reminded me of the Japan's Pacific Belt Investment Initiative launched in 1960s, much bigger than such an initiative. The idea of Deepening was endorsed in 2006, and Japan pledges $4.5 billion to the Deepening project. And Japan presented 19 projects, prospective projects. However, the biggest issue is that Japanese enthusiasm and participation in the Deepening seem to be declining. Of the 19 projects, only remarkable success can be found in one case, logistic data bank project. It's an IT-driven logistics visualization service project. Next, I look at the Western dedicated freight corridor. This will be a game changer for the enhancement of logistics in Western India. But due to time constraints, here I only point out some issues of the Western DFC. Special terms for economic partnership loans. That means tied loan in favor of Japanese companies was applied in this project. However, Japanese companies refrained from participating in the civil engineering work and even the electric locomotive project. But secondly, there has been much delay in construction progress for various reasons, including land acquisition problem. The construction was scheduled to be completed by March 2017, which was postponed to July this year. However, the section between Rewari, Haryana, and Palampur, Gujarat, the 40% total track of Western DFC was partially opened in July 2001, last year. This means the logistics using the Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru port, Mumbai, will be left behind. Yeah. Next, look at the Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed railway. Total project cost was estimated to be 980 billion rupee, and approximately 80% of the cost would be covered by Japanese ODA, with terms and conditions quite favorable to India. Here, I'd like to point out two issues. First, due to tardy progress of land acquisition in Maharashtra, the inauguration date for this high-speed railway was revised from December 2000 next year to October 2028, while with the Indian government holding idea of commencing operation on the 352 kilometers in Gujarat in 2027. So the land acquisition program yes, regard to be clear. Second, under the prolonged construction period, the big issues are how to come to terms with cost overruns between India and Japan, and how to maintain high-level cooperation posture among the Japanese stakeholders, including East Japan Railway. This railway company is in charge of transferring Shinkansen technology to India. So next, I briefly touch the bilateral collaboration in ICT. IT collaboration between the two countries remained far below the potential level, with Japan accounting for only about 1% of the total Indian IT services export. But meanwhile, reflecting that both Japan and India are natural partners based on mutual respect and reliance, memorandum of cooperation on digital partnership and also in the field of cybersecurity were already signed. As part of stepping up the cooperation in the field of ICT, the Japanese companies NEC laid a submarine fiber optical cable connecting Andaman and Nicobar Island to the mainland India in 2020. I think this was discussed in the previous session. So there's a growing awareness in Japan that Japan needs to learn a lot from the experience of digital India for the promotion of the digital transformation.
Maybe, Professor Kojima, sorry to interrupt. If you can
Yes.
put in a minute.
Concrete. Okay.
Thank you.
As natural partners, bilateral India-Japan relations used to play an essential part of boosting Japan industrial development since the beginning of Meiji era until the reconstruction period after World War II. Of the various aspects of our relations, trade remained sluggish, and IT collaboration is still far below the potential level, while Japanese FDI in India has been more active. Currently, various initiatives are taken to reduce the dependence on China for supply chain. In India, production-linked incentive scheme were launched in 2020. And the Quad members, Japan, India, Australia, launched the supply chain resilience initiative in April 2021. These movements, I hope, are expected to act as a tailwind for the expansion of bilateral economic relations. Finally, gigantic projects, the Mumbai, or the DFC, or high-speed railroad, were launched under framework of strategic and global partnership. So every possible effort should be made between two countries to accomplish the flagship project. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kojima, for presenting a comprehensive overview for the India-Japan economic and development cooperation from trade investment. You also talked about development cooperation and also highlighting some of the challenges and issues. Thank you very much. We will come back to you if you have any questions in the Q&A session. Let's move to the next speaker, Professor Taneja. She will be presenting about increasing India's market access in Japan. So over to you, Professor Taneja. Professor Kojima, if you can exit your PPT.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Yeah, still it is showing you
sharing. Sorry.
Yeah, you just.
Okay.
Share. Then the slide share and the green button on the bottom of the screen.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Nisha, you have to unmute.
Good afternoon, Prabir and everyone. I'm just trying to share my presentation. So I was trying to do it simultaneously while the other one was getting hooked off. So if you just give me a moment, I will share my.
Please.
Yeah.
You have to actually share your screen. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Unmute.
And thank you, Makoto-san. You actually mentioned some of the things that I will be mentioning in my presentation. So you've given me a nice opening point. Now, what I'm focusing on is basically India-Japan trade and FDI, with a focus on how India can actually improve its market access into the Japanese market through the trade and investment FDI linkages. One. So it was mentioned that how the trade trends in India and Japan post CEPA have actually fluctuated quite a lot. And the total trade peaked in 2012 at $19 billion, and it stood at 14 billion in 2020. And now, if we look at the trade balance, we can see that there has been a large trade deficit between that India has had with Japan, and the deficit peaked at 7.8 billion in 2018. Now, if we look at the bilateral trade between India and Japan, we find that actually the bilateral trade is actually far more important in India's trade than it is for Japan's trade with the rest of the world. Now, the remaining, Prabir very rightly said that we should not be actually talking only about trade deficits with the particular bilateral trade deficits, because what our concern should be with overall trade deficits. But the reason why I'm trying to focus on the deficit and how it can be addressed bilaterally is simply to highlight the fact that how is it that India can actually increase or improve its market access into Japan. And this is in line with India's overall strategy of increasing its exports worldwide. And if it were to increase its market access to Japan, what is it that it could do to improve it? Now, for that, for the remaining presentation, what I'm going to focus on is what is India's export potential to Japan? How can India increase its market access into Japan? What are the tariff and non-tariff barriers which India faces in the Japanese market? How can Japan increase its FDI inflows to strengthen the trade FDI linkage? And how can the new supply chains be forged for greater supply chain resilience? Now, if we look at the top 5 products that India has exported, we find that these top products are organic chemicals, fish, mineral fuels, precious stones, and machinery. And in all these products, we find that there has been an increase in share since 2015, except for mineral fuels, where there has been a decline. If we look at imports, we find that The major items are machinery, electrical and machinery equipment, copper, plastic, and inorganic chemicals. And the last three items, we can see that there was an increase in imports in the last three items, but a decrease in the top two items. At a disaggregated level, the largest item that is exported is light oils and frozen shrimps. And at a disaggregated level, if you look at the import basket, I think in 2020, the largest item was copper and inorganic or organic compounds. Now, what we've tried to do is actually to calculate the trade potential that India has with Japan. And for that, we've followed a very simple methodology, which is that we've looked at those items as having potential, which Japan is importing from the world, but not from India. And within these items, we've selected those items which are globally competitive, which means that where they exhibit a revealed comparative advantage of greater than 1, because these are the items that are more likely to be exported to Japan because of their global competitiveness. So what we find is that there are 1,511 items at the 6-digit level, which have an export potential. And this export potential amounts to $88 billion. And the top, the currently traded products, which are about 712, account for 76 billion. And this translates to basically 87% of the total export potential. So which means that it is basically the items that are currently being exported to Japan, which hold a much larger potential than those products that are currently not being exported at all. So, if you're trying to see whether we should diversify or concentrate on already being traded products, then maybe we should be focusing more on the current products. Now, if we look at the tariffs, what we find is that almost 91.5% of the items actually face zero tariffs. And this is thanks to the CEPA agreement. And dairy in the highest bracket, which is 20 to 35% tariff bracket, there are only 0.6% of the items that are accounted for within this bracket. And these include items like dairy products, like butter, cheese, and as well as some other agricultural products like natural honey and some processed foods. However, these items actually only contribute to 0.1% of the total export potential to Japan. Now, this table looks a little complicated, but I'll go column by column. Basically, what we've done is we've tried to identify the items that have the largest largest export potential, which is the first column, or column number 3. And adjacent to that, we have India's current exports, and then we've mapped the current tariff rates that Japan is imposing on these items, and then we've mapped the non-tariff barriers or the regulations that apply to these products. And lastly, what we've tried to do is mapped these are the color codes that you see. From the Ministry of Environment, we have actually got the list of products that are most polluting. And basically what the ministry does is that it actually classifies all the products based on the level of the pollution that they emit. And these are color coded into red, green, white, and clearly red is red indicates the highest level of pollution. And we can see that 6 out of these 10 items that have a lot of potential actually are the polluting industries. Now, going back to the first column where there is a large export potential, we can see that it is pharmaceutical products which have the highest export potential, and that's about $14 billion. And we can see that the current trade is very low. it's only $63 million. And here, I think where India faces a problem is that it finds entry into the market difficult, meeting the regulations, whether it is in terms of standards or whether it is in terms of labeling requirements or whether it is in terms of entering into the market and the long time process that it requires. Another problem that there could be is that India is not a member of the PICS Convention, and maybe that kind of doesn't allow us to enter the Japanese. Some areas where we could actually make an effort and others where we could bilaterally discuss and improve market access. Then we have other items like light petroleum oil and other petroleum oils, where they are subjected to various technical requirements related to standards, also related to hazardous chemicals. So again, it's a TBT measure, and meeting quality standards becomes a problem. Even in the case of meat, it is the standards related to food and additives which could pose a problem. In the case of t-shirts, it is possible that there are requirements for harmful substances which maybe we are not meeting the standards. And in motor vehicles, it could be the requirements, the qualities requirements that are needed to enter the market. Next, what we've tried to do is look at India-Japan FDI flows. And as was mentioned earlier, there has been no discerning trend, but the cumulative FDI inflows have been about $35 billion, and India is the 5th largest investor in 2020. And if we look at the disaggregated level, it is the automobile industry which has attracted the largest proportion of FDI, followed by services, and then drugs and pharmaceuticals, metallurgical industries, and telecommunications. And the aggregate of these top 5 sectors is 62% of the total FDI. Now, how can India actually improve or attract more FDI into India from Japan? Well, India has recently announced the production-linked incentive scheme, and basically what the scheme's objective is that to provide incentives to companies on incremental sales over the base year, and the incentive is 4 to 6% on incremental sales, and the total outlay is quite huge. It's 1.97 lakh crore of rupees. And there are 13 sectors that India has currently identified that qualify for this, for the PLI scheme. And you can see the list. There's mobile manufacturing, APIs, medical devices, ACC batteries, electronic products, automobile and components, pharmaceuticals, telecom, textiles, etc. And the scheme is actually meant to encourage both domestic and foreign companies. And this should be what we're hoping to see is a larger inflow through this scheme. Now, keeping this scheme in mind, what we've also tried to do is that how many of these items that have a large export potential actually fall under the PLI scheme. And we find that there are quite a few of these items that fall under the PLI scheme. So not only is there a export potential, but these are also items where the PLI scheme is applicable. So these are areas where we really could take advantage of to not only to increase FDI, but also to improve our exports and market access into the Japanese market. These are items like medicaments or pharmaceuticals, motor vehicles, sacks and bags of man-made fibers, fish, steel, and antibiotics or APIs. Lastly, I think what I would like to talk about is, since I've talked about trade and FDI, I think trade and FDI go hand in hand. Basically, these are the two key pillars for having a supply chain. And global supply chain resilience is today the new buzzword. And especially post-COVID, there has been a huge emphasis on having resilient supply chains. And we all know that India, Japan, and Australia have actually signed on to the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. And basically, what we need to do is, if we actually look at global supply chains, and if we look at items where there is a huge demand, and again, semiconductor manufacturing is an item which is on the PLI scheme. And this is an item of the future. So even though we may not see an export potential today, this is an item of the future, and we all know how important this is for steering the fourth industrial revolution. And this is a very complex supply chain. So if you look at the supply chain, we can see it could be as many as 29 countries in a particular stage of the global supply chain that could be involved. And so it is important that we expand this initiative between India and Japan and include ASEAN into the picture, so that we can create these new resilient supply chains of the future. So let me just sum up quickly on the key highlights. Now, India has an untapped export potential of $89 billion. Sorry. Sorry, one moment.
You need to take it back. Yeah. Yeah.
So just to sum up, it's $88 billion, the potential, and currently exported products actually account of the majority of the potential, which is 87%. Tariffs, so we should be focusing more on the products that are already being exported. Tariffs are low under CEPA, and almost 97% of Indian exports to Japan are in the 0.5% range. The top 10 items have export potential have very low tariffs, and ranging between 0 to 0.4%. And therefore, we need to be looking at non-tariff barriers to improve market access. We've seen that pharmaceuticals have the largest potential of $14 billion, but there are non-tariff barriers that need to be addressed. 6 of the top 10 potential items fall in the category of highly polluting industries. India needs to gear itself to adopt clean technology to be able to increase its exports of these items, and FDI can be an effective channel for transfer of such technologies. India has, in fact, recently India signed the Clean Energy Partnership Agreement, and this can actually be leveraged to increase exports. India offers the PLI in items having a large export potential, such as pharmaceuticals, active APIs, motor vehicles, fish, steel, and sacks and bags of man-made fibers, and this needs to be leveraged on. And finally, we need to broaden the bilateral dialogue, starting with India, Japan, and including ASEAN into the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Taneja. Excellent presentations. I mean, I thought that you will be only talking about India's market access issues in Japan, but you picked up FDI. You have identified, some direction for encouraging India's trade with Japan, and very nicely plotting it with PLI scheme and the takeaways. Thank you very much. As always, you come with an excellent presentation, paper, and things. So thank you very much. Professor Taneja. Let me move on. And the last speaker, Dr. Kalpana Tokas, we have a high expectation from her because she will be speaking about services trade and also the India-Japan CEPA. So there is a discussion at the moment that when are you going to review the CEPA? Widening deficit, etc., etc. So I'm sure she will be addressing. So over to you, Dr. Kalpana, for the next 10 to 12 minutes, if you can. And then we will have Q&A sessions where you will get a chance to speak as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. B. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
So firstly and foremostly, I would like to thank ICWA for giving me this opportunity where I'm kind of sharing this space with such eminent scholars and renowned people whose work I have read throughout. So as Professor Day said, that I have next 10 to 12 minutes. Pardon me for a bulky presentation because I'm drawing it from a study which we conducted. I'll try to be as brief as possible and share some of the findings of this study we conducted. It was co-authored with Professor Rupa Chanda, who is affiliated with IIM Bangalore, and this study was funded by India-Japan Study Center at IIM Bangalore. That is where I did my PhD from. So quickly, I'll move forth. So as my title suggests, that I'll be talking mostly about services trade, and I'll be giving you few results because this was a qualitative study we conducted, and I'll talk about some kind of opportunities and barriers in selected services sector. So firstly, if I talk about services trade and its significance for both India and Japan, it plays an important role both for India as well as for Japan. So if we look at it, the GDP contribution of services sector, including the construction sector, comes out to be almost 62% for India's GDP. And this figure stands at 72.2% of the Japanese GDP coming from the services sector. Now, we all know that India's growth story has been kind of pulled by the services sector, and India's services exports have grown manifold. Just to see the numbers, you can see that it grew from only 52 billion USD in 2005 to almost 205 billion USD in 2018. And if we look at the rankings, India is ranked 7th in global services exports and 10th in global services imports. And we know that the bulk of this is coming from the IT and the IT enabled services sector, which I'll be talking about in detail as I move forward. Japan also has seen some growth happening in the services sector exports, but probably not as high as India. It rose from 102 billion to 192 billion. This is mostly because we all understand and know, as the data has been showing us, that the main competitiveness of Japan as far as exports are concerned lies in the goods sector. So moving forward, if I look at what has been the trade between these two countries at a bilateral level, and if you look at this table, which comes from our study, and it is constructed by us for that study, you can look at India's exports to Japan and India's import from Japan. Our data is a bit dated because the data on bilateral services trade is pretty limited. So we have tried to kind of make do with it. But as you can see, over these 10 years, 2005 to 2015, there has not been much increase in the trade and services between the two countries. And even if we look at the years that followed the CEPA, there has not been some humongous change which we have noticed. So that is a point of concern, which the previous speakers also were kind of hinting towards, that services sector kind of is somewhere we have not been able to utilize the potential. All right. And if I look at the bilateral relative comparative advantage of India's trade with Japan, one sector that again is catching our eye is the IT and information services sector, where we have a positive Rcap, which means we hold the competitiveness here. So that is kind of building the context about which sector I'll be talking about. Now, the fact that how India and Japan are trading, if we contrast it with some other partners of Japan as well as India, it shows us that there is some potential to be exploited, which we haven't as of now. Because if you see that if I talk about Japan's exports to India as far as services are concerned, India ranks 17th as in the importance ranking. While if we compare it with China, China is ranking 2nd. Similarly, if I talk about India's exports, all right, we see that yes, it has exported USD 4.8 billion worth of services to Japan, but compare it with the US, where the number has been, relatively high. So there is some scope which we probably aren't utilizing. Now, this is also clear that we can exploit the comparative advantage which each of us have. For example, India has competitive advantage in IT and information services and other business services where skilled labor is needed. And on the other hand, Japan's comparative advantage lies in things like technology, infrastructure, knowledge-intensive services. So there is some complementarity. Now, if I'm talking about services, I cannot leave behind FDI. And the speakers before me have kind of nicely covered what is the FDI situation at bilateral level for both the countries. So I will be very brief about this. So as mentioned earlier, that FDI from Japan to India, if we look at the cumulative numbers for past 20 years or so, we see that it has been majorly concentrated in manufacturing. And even if we see the sentiment of Japanese manufacturing companies, they consider India as the topmost destination they would like to put their investment in. This is according to the JBIC report. But lately, we have been starting to see a trend that the services sector has also been attracting the FDI. The sectors such as financial, banking, insurance are some of the key sectors where we have seen Japanese investment has been forthcoming to India. Some of them are these banking companies like Mizuho, Bank of Tokyo, etc. Then we have Japanese asset management companies, life insurance companies. Also, we have now been witnessing Japanese investment in the health sector. It's a 100% FDI hospital in Bangalore called Sakra. So this change has started to happen, realizing the importance of services and its intermingling with manufacturing that we are actually seeing. But to be honest, we know that Japan is one of the highest, one of the ranking highest in the source countries for FDI, while India is ranking a highest for recipient. But even after that, if I individually see what is happening between Japan and India, there are much better farers with these two countries as compared to them acting together. For example, that Japan, yes, it's an important source for India. It accounted for 7% of inward FDI in India in 2018. But if I see where most of the Japanese FDI is going in the services sector, it is primarily in US, China, and Europe. So that has still not been explored to the fullest. Now, talking about why I chose to combine the services and the CEPA part is the significance of services in PTAs today. When I say PTA, I mean preferential trading agreements or free trade agreements in which most of the countries are forming a part of these days. And what is the latest feature that we have been seeing in these PTAs is that they're no longer restricted to only goods. We're not dealing just in goods and lowering tariffs, but we are trying to talk about services. We're trying to talk about FDI, labor issues, IPR issues, etc., etc. And also, if I look at the world trade, the share of services in the world trade has been rising at a much higher pace than the goods trade has been rising. And of course, services are the talk of the town because of the changes that have happened. ICT has developed, then FDI has been liberalized, and foremost is the growing importance of global value chains. So when I say global value chain, services come hand in hand with the manufacturing, and therefore services form a key component of the PTAs. But there arises a problem that I would be talking about, that though India and Japan have entered a CEPA, I'll not go through the details of CEPA because we all are very well aware of the CEPA. We have the people who designed CEPA probably. I've talked about the joint study group here, which recommended that this is a good idea to go ahead with the CEPA between India because there are mutual complementarities. There are complementarities in the form of demography. That is, India is a young population and Japan is an aging society. Plus, India has a cost-effective labor force while Japan is facing rising wages. Also, we can provide skill-intensive activities while Japan is more to do with R&D and technology. And obviously, India comes up as a huge market which many developed countries are aiming to target because of our growing middle class. And there's a huge potential there. So the recommendation was to go ahead with this India-Japan CEPA, and as the name suggests, CEPA, that is Comprehensive Economic Partnership, we are talking about much more than goods. We were talking about services, we were talking about investments. But if we have a quick look at what happened to the services trade after the CEPA came into being, all right, in August 2011, we see not much has been achieved. As in 2019, Commerce Minister pointed out that despite its commitment in CEPA, market access for India's goods and services remain elusive. If I quickly go through the data, we see that India's export of goods to Japan have actually declined in this period, and the services exports to India increased only marginally. Similarly, if I talk about IT services, where India is considered to be the competitive market leader, that kind of exports to Japan hardly increased from US dollar 2.1 billion to hardly 3 billion, even after the signing of the CEPA. And the ranking of the countries in each other's ladder of significance actually declined. So the question arises, why have we not been able to kind of utilize the CEPA for services sector, where India probably thinks that that we have the competitive advantage? So what we did was we carried out a survey, which was a qualitative study, and we picked up 4 sectors in the four services sector. I would be talking only about 2 sectors because of the paucity of time, but they were namely education services, IT and IT-enabled services, tech startups, and engineering services. And these were qualitative interviews which were conducted in person and on telephone based on semi-structured questionnaires. Open-ended discussions were held. I'll just briefly talk about what were the results and why we chose these sectors. So if I talk about education services, again, an area of complementarity, because India is a young population. It has the largest population in the age bracket of 5 to 24 years, and therefore it becomes an attractive destination for investment in education services. On the other hand, if I talk about Japan, because of a decline in the number of students in the similar age bracket, they're not being able to run it at full capacity. There have been some initiatives taken by MEXT at Japan, where they have tried to internationalize their universities. They are incorporating a cultural exchange, a student exchange, etc., because they want to internationalize the universities, to open their centers in other countries, get young students from other countries, etc. So again, there's a scope of complementarity. Again, one complementarity arises with the fact that Japan offers a large market where they want to learn English, because it has become a much needed skill in today's global world. And India, because of its colonial heritage, etc., is considered to be a decent enough option if we look at economically as compared to the Western countries, to impart English education. So there's a very much scope for collaboration in the form of student exchange, faculty exchange, research exchange, and scientific research collaborations, etc.
Sorry to bother you, Dr. Kalpana, please finish in a minute, please, because we don't have much time and we will have to a Q&A session.
Sure. So if I quickly jump to what were the opportunities this sector opens, it was the fact that the Japanese educational institutions are considered to be of very high quality, and the Japanese curricula is very well appreciated in India. Also, what is important is that a lot of Indians are also eager to learn Japanese language because of Japan's prowess in manufacturing, hardware, automotive, electronics. There are huge firms and businesses which have come up, and if I want a job there, probably knowing Japanese is a good idea. So there's a huge market for Japanese language learning here. But if you look at the barriers, the key barriers which always arise, firstly, is the problem of language and communication. The students who are going on exchange are quite hesitant to go to these countries. Indian students to Japan and vice versa, because of the lack of connect they feel, because there have been less number of success stories as compared to Indians going to the US and being CEOs of the big companies, etc. So there is always some kind of hesitancy. Secondly, Indian students pointed out that there are few programs in English as a medium of instruction in Japan. Therefore, they probably do not want to go there for higher studies. And there is a lack of sync between the number of years you have to spend as an undergraduate in Japan versus India, the 3 and the 4 years debate. Japanese students, on the other hand, also highlighted that the lack of infrastructural facilities in the Indian universities, like hostels, mess, disability friendliness, is not up to the standards what they would expect when choosing a destination. Similarly, the one main reason was lack of awareness. The Japanese students were not aware of the great institutes in India they could be a part of, apart from the IIT. Same for India. So there's a huge lack of marketing that has been happening. And probably they said that CEPA is something which can help increase the visibility of each other's educational institutions. Similarly, CEPA can push that Indian schools start teaching the Japanese language from the school level itself, so that in the future, it opens up the avenues of Japan as a destination for studying, and some alignment of the curricula across the countries could again help us do that. And of course, the role of government cannot be stressed enough, because Indians often find cost of education in Japan to be very high. So if some country-specific scholarships could be assigned, or some linkages with the Japanese universities and Japanese industries, which could be conducted where Indian students can study, they have an incentive to join the Japanese businesses which have been flourishing. This is something which could probably be taken up. I'll stop here. That would be all.
Thank you very much. Sorry to pursue in finishing it very quickly. Thank you. Thank you all 3 speakers. They spoke eloquently, nicely, and a lot of food for thoughts. And I think we open the floor and digitally. So if anyone is having any questions, we have 5 minutes to go. So please raise your hand. You can use the digital icon. I can come back to you. If you have a questions, briefly, you can type it in the chat box. And the 5 minutes, not enough. And if I see nothing coming, then I have 3 questions to the 3 speakers, and then we'll go for just closing remarks and hand over to Dr. Jochin. Please.
Professor Day, I mean, I just want to say that we can actually extend the session for about 10 minutes more.
10 minutes, okay.
Also,
okay.
It's a good idea if we can actually bring in the speakers if they have questions or queries to ask or make comments about their presentation or something.
Sure. So we have 10 minutes instead of 5. So I don't see anyone coming with their questions out of the participants. Yeah, there is a question I see in the chat box to Professor Kojima. This question to you: that Japan has moved away from consumer goods to producer goods. Well, goods producer and consumer almost similar, but this has reduced competitiveness of Japanese companies like Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, etc. in consumer electronics. Example, mobile phones, semiconductor industry, South Korea, Taiwan have figured more prominently in the Indian market. Considering that India is a consumer country, I mean that in the very strong consumer class, not a producer country, I beg to differ. Will this decline continue because many of the Japanese companies have stopped competing in terms of price? So, Professor Kojima, please respond to the questions. You may not have to give everything, but whatever you would like to respond, it's over to you. You have to unmute. Unmute, please. You have to unmute. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you for question. As for electric appliances, the Japanese lag behind Korea or Chinese products, such as mobile phone or TV. But in the case of air conditioners, Daikin is very competitive. So there are still some in areas where Japanese companies have competitive power. So I agree that generally speaking, Japanese companies are not cost competitive.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of in the market, maybe China or Korean companies are more competitive power than Japanese companies, but we have still in some areas very strong companies. So my question for the consumer durables.
Yes, consumer durables.
Yes, but in other areas, we have growing companies coming to India in wider area, such as retailers or the cosmetics. Yeah, I think we have some challenge to compete with Korea, Chinese makers, but still we have some advantage in some areas. Sorry, that's my answers.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions or anyone would like to speak? I think let me ask 3 questions. We have a few minutes to 3 speakers. I start with the last one. It's a very interesting presentation. It was based on a study with Rupa Chandra. So Dr. Tokas, please highlight us. 50 sample, not enough, but given that the point we highlighted that 88% of your sample, they said that barriers are too much, etc., etc. So please tell us when you pick up an education, and one of your points was that educational degrees and diplomas are not acknowledged by each other, which the trade economists, particularly, will tell you that we haven't signed MRAs. So please tell us, what happened. We have committed politically to implement MRA, and we have committed to implement CEPA, but where it has lost, that why the 2 countries didn't sign mutual recognition agreement or acknowledging the degrees and diplomas. This is the questions to you. If you have time, please tell us. Questions to Professor Taneja. Excellent presentation, but if you can tell us that facilitation of Indian exports in Japanese market. While I was there, what I've seen, that some of the ASEAN countries are very active, in terms of trade fair, in terms of providing incentives, support, language, etc., etc. But in that context, India is somehow missing in that, in Japanese. So what would be your recommendations? These industry associations, when there's only one organization I have noticed, Indian organization, and maybe now more. So if you can tell us that, in which way we should encourage Indian companies' exports to Japan. And Professor Kojima, the technology is a big issue for India, Japan. And what I found that at the ground level, which is basically SMEs or SME, small entrepreneurs, big difficulties for them to do, at a farm level to do in collaboration with the Japan or from Japan to India on the technology transfer or technological collaborations. If you can, Japan's investments means it is lots of SMEs, small and medium entrepreneurs, they come with, the technology, but it's difficult to join hands with an Indian counterpart. So if you can tell us, guide us, in which way, we can strengthen our technology cooperation, basically at a ground level, not at a very high, multinationals. Yeah. So to come, Professor Tokas, Dr. Tokas, over to you.
So, not justifying the sample size, but basically it was a qualitative study where we have cited that how a smaller sample works for a qualitative study. what I am aware of is when you talk about MRAs, etc., yes, there have been initiatives. What I am aware of is that there was some initiative signed between the Japanese government and the Indian government regarding the engineering degrees being recognized across the, I mean, it was over and above the CEPA, which was very, I mean, not very long back signed, so that to deal with this problem. While I was talking about this was primarily coming from school. I mean, I happened to talk to the students who have been studying Japanese. I mean, when we talked about IT and other sectors, the key problem came that Japan was never considered as a destination to go for higher studies. And therefore, when we talk to people who were actually studying Japanese studies, and they wanted to go for higher study because Japan automatically becomes their destination of a higher study, they told from their practical experiences that they faced non-transparency in the admission procedure. Plus, there was some kind of this mismatch in their degrees. They wanted that a standard undergrad program in, say, JNU is for 3 years, then going there, they would want a degree for 4 years, this and that. So that is where probably we were focused. I mean, I'm not very sure, you would know better, that MRA was probably talking about the IT sector and the engineering degree recognition when we move on to the job level, that is that working, that is the mode 4 when people travel, but to work in some other industry. But if I'm talking about other kind of avenues for education, say Japanese language, etc., maybe specific for that, some kind of if we are picking up sectors, I mean, if we are cherry picking the sectors, specific something is needed. That is probably what I think should.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Taneja.
Thank you, Prabir, for that question. That's a very important question that you raised. You're very right that we really need to step up our marketing efforts, because traditionally it has been Europe and the US which have been our export markets. And so all our marketing efforts have been focused on these traditional markets. So whether it is trade fairs or whatever. So, but on the with the Eastern markets, that's been kind of missing. So we need to cultivate that, we need to initiate that. And I think here, maybe our export promotion councils need to get revamped and, you know, have a market-oriented approach towards entering into the markets. And here, I think, for instance, they could have separate desks for different countries, and for Japan, maybe there could be a desk. And in today's times, maybe COVID has taught us that it doesn't have to be a physical exhibition or a physical fair where buyers and sellers meet. It could actually be a virtual fair. And so maybe these are possibilities that can be explored. But again, I think it is an institutional mechanism that needs to be put in place. Of course, the chambers of commerce are always very active, but if there is a good public-private partnership, that could kind of give it the fillip that it really needs.
Thank you. Professor Kojima, over to you.
Yes, I just give you one answer to your question. You mentioned the technical transfer from Japan to India, or the collaboration between two countries. In Japan, we have a Deepening Prize, known as one of the highest awards for total quality management in the world. It was established just after the World War II. And the total number of the companies awarded the Deming Prize has amounted to 260 during a period from 1951 to 2020. Much of the companies, Japanese companies, but however, looking at the current period from 2001 to 2021, of the total 78 awarded companies, as many as 36 companies were Indian companies. So Indian companies using the Japanese such a award system for improve the quality management. So I think this gives us some ground for cooperation between Japanese and Indian companies. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Just one answer.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, this questions came at the very last moment, but to Professor Kojima, could you please give us a perspective on Japanese sentiments on India's decision not to join RCEP and implications for the economic relations? Well, it is well known, but I give it to you. You know, if you say anything on that,
But
there is a
question.
Yeah, there are
CEPA.
RCEP, yes. Japanese sentiments on India's decision to quit RCEP.
Excuse me, what do you mean by CEPA?
RCEP.
RCEP, sorry.
RCEP.
Okay. We are, honestly speaking, we are discouraged that India withdraw from the RCEP. However, we understand the Indians' decision because the Indian has a huge deficit against East Asia countries, including Japan. So if India join RCEP, maybe the deficit against China become much bigger. So we understand the Indian decision, but still we hope in the future, after India become more competitive, India will join RCEP in the future. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. With that note, I close the session, and I thank three eminent speakers, Professor Kojima, Professor Taneja, and Dr. Kalpana. The session was on economic and development cooperation. I'm sure many of the issues in economic and development cooperation we discussed, we could not take up many others, which might be you will be having an opportunity in future at ICW and other forums to discuss. So I thank everybody. And thank you very much. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you.
Kojima. And handing over to Dr. Jojin, who is from ICWA looking after the conference. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you for chairing the session. And I would also like to thank the speakers for their excellent remarks, Professor Kojima, Professor Taneja, and Dr. Tokas. With this, we come to the conclusion, the end of the session 4.